200 milligrams of caffeine, meaning a single dose, at precisely the time that you're used to getting it each day. Now that we've talked about some of the incredible mechanisms by which caffeine changes our experience of life, increases alertness and mood, etc., I want to talk about the use of caffeine as a tool. Now, caffeine is a very potent and useful tool for enhancing mental health, physical health, and performance. But there are certain considerations one has to keep in mind, in particular, dose. Now, first off, not everybody will respond to the same dose of caffeine the same way, but we can reliably say that your body weight is a good measure by which you can estimate what a healthy, useful dose of caffeine would be. So for most people, ingesting 1 to 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight is going to be the range in which caffeine can have positive effects without making us feel overly anxious and give us that feeling that we're jumping out of our skin and turn the otherwise positive experience of caffeine into an aversive one. For those of you that aren't familiar with thinking in terms of kilograms and normally thinking pounds, I'll just quickly give you some general estimations that, for instance, 100 kilograms equals 220 pounds. So for me, I weigh 100 kilograms. That means that 1 to 3 milligrams, again, milligrams, thousandths of a gram, 1 to 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight would mean for me, I could safely ingest 100 to 300 milligrams of caffeine in a single dose, in a single drink, if that's the way I'm consuming it. Go for them if that's the way that I'm consuming it. And it's very likely that that will be a tolerable dose. However, if you are not somebody that's accustomed to drinking caffeine on a regular basis, I suggest you start on the lower end of that 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight range. So for instance, if you're somebody who weighs 50 kilograms, that's approximately 110 pounds, and you would be pretty comfortable ingesting somewhere between 50 and 150 milligrams of caffeine. So what I recommend is that people who are considering using caffeine as a tool or who are already ingesting caffeine start to think about the dosage of caffeine that you are ingesting or plan to ingest and the timing in which you ingest that caffeine relative to certain tasks throughout your day, your waking and your sleeping. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But the first step for you is to figure out how much you weigh in kilograms and then to go to that number of 1 to 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. And that's a good range in which you might want to explore the use of caffeine in a single application, meaning in a single dose. Now, I do realize that some people out there are drinking coffee all day long or having coffee in the morning and then again in the afternoon. What I'm referring to here is the ingestion of caffeine in a single bout, right? 1 cup of coffee or 2 cups of coffee, for instance, to achieve that 100 to 300 milligram range if that's what's appropriate for your body weight. But to avoid any confusion, when I talk about dosage of caffeine, what I'm really talking about is not the total amount of caffeine ingested per day. I'm talking about the total amount of caffeine ingested in one sitting or setting, that is. And if you're somebody who's drinking caffeine multiple times throughout the day, you can imagine, for instance, let's say the appropriate dose for you in order to get an enhancement in mental performance or physical performance is 200 milligrams. And you are somebody who's doing some work in the morning and you want to have that lift in the morning to be able to focus better, and you're doing some physical exercise in the afternoon or vice versa, that you would ingest 200 milligrams of caffeine at 2 separate times per day, separated by about 4 hours. Now, you don't have to separate them. You could put them 2 hours apart, for instance, but we'll talk about half-life of caffeine and so forth. Just keep in mind that if you're ingesting 200 milligrams of caffeine and that's the appropriate dose for you based on your body weight, and then you are ingesting another 200 milligrams of caffeine an hour later, you are effectively ingesting approximately 400 milligrams of caffeine, which is going to start exceeding the dose in which you can normally tolerate without feeling anxious and jittery. With all of that said, there is a range of tolerance for caffeine that's based on 2 things. One is a pre-existing disposition. That is, whether or not your genetics and nervous system and the backdrop of your life, how much stress you're experiencing, tends to make you feel more anxious and alert and jittery before you ingest any caffeine. And the other is how so-called caffeine adapted you are. We often hear about tolerance. Tolerance means something very specific. It's the ability to ingest more and more of something with a plateau that is a no increase or an actual reduction in the effectiveness of that thing. But here we're not really talking about tolerance to caffeine. What we're talking about is being caffeine adapted. A simple way to understand whether or not you're caffeine adapted or not is that if you drink caffeine and it tends to increase your heart rate and make you feel more alert and a bit more anxious, then chances are you are not caffeine adapted, provided the amount of caffeine is within the healthy range for you, that is, the ranges we talked about a moment ago. However, if you're somebody who drinks caffeine and you actually feel alert and relaxed, chances are you are caffeine adapted. And so at various times during today's episode, I'll talk about people who are caffeine adapted and people who are not caffeine adapted. We'll talk about the use of caffeine every other day. I know for you habitual caffeine drinkers, including myself, just the simple mention of that probably sounds aversive, but there is actually great utility to using caffeine every other day as opposed to every day. But just keep in mind that some people will drink caffeine and not get much of a lift from it at all. Other people will drink caffeine and they will feel extremely anxious, even at dosages far lower than that 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight range that I described a moment ago. So you have to take into account individual differences. That said, 1 to 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight for a given sitting, for your morning coffee or your morning yerba mate tea, is a good range from which to start. And I do encourage you to go online and look up the various beverages and foods that you might be eating that contain caffeine. For instance, some people are surprised to discover that the coffee that they get from some of the more standard popular vendors out there, the small coffee or the medium coffee, for instance, can contain as much as 400 to 600 milligrams of caffeine, and the large coffee that is often sold at those commercial vendors can contain as much as 1 gram, 1,000 milligrams of caffeine. Now, you may be adapted to that such that it doesn't make you feel anxious, but if you wonder why you feel irritable and you get a headache when you don't get that caffeine or that amount of caffeine at precisely the time that you're used to getting it each day, that's because you are consuming quite large quantities of caffeine on a regular basis. So I do recommend, whether or not you drink soda or coffee or tea, that you figure out the source of that. Okay, so figure out what vendor you purchase it from, what kind of coffee, and go online and spend a little bit of time, because the information is out there, to discover what levels of caffeine you're actually ingesting. Now, if you happen to be ingesting more than 1 to 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of caffeine, that's not necessarily bad. However, you do want to be careful about ingesting very high levels of caffeine over long periods of time in your life, because there can be issues that start to arise, in particular a bias towards higher levels of anxiety and depletion of certain electrolytes, because caffeine is a diuretic, can cause you to lose sodium and other things of that sort. And also, just from simply a dependent standpoint, it does appear that if you ingest high levels of caffeine, that is exceeding the dosages that normally you could get away with and get just as much mental enhancing and physical enhancing benefits, that you can cause some disruption to the microvasculature. You can bias yourself towards headaches, anxiety attacks, and you can become actually quite irritable when you're not getting those higher levels of caffeine. So I do encourage you to figure out not just what an appropriate caffeine dosage would be for you, but also how much caffeine you might already be ingesting.